My son gave me two choices that Tuesday afternoon: nursing home or get out. "Dad, you've lost value," he said, like I was a broken appliance he needed to replace. "I'm Garrick Patterson, 72 years old, and for 45 years, I thought I knew my boy Eddie. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I wasn't wrong about everything. Sometimes the quiet pawn on a chessboard is actually the disguised queen. This story has more twists than a professional wrestling match, and every single one of them is going to hit you harder than Eddie's words hit me that day. Before we dive in, make sure you hit subscribe, because you're going to want to follow this journey to the very end. And drop a comment telling me where you feel safest in this world, because by the time we're done here, you'll understand why that matters more than you think. Eddie stood in the kitchen of my modest house at 418 Oak Street in Bellevue, Washington, checking his phone for the third time in 5 minutes. His wife had been calling all morning about overdue Garricks. The gambling debts were piling up faster than he could hide them from her, and I could see the desperation creeping into his eyes. "Dad, we need to talk." His voice carried that familiar tone, the one he'd used since he was 12 whenever he wanted something. "You're 72. Living alone in this big house doesn't make sense anymore." I set down my coffee cup carefully, the same cup I'd been drinking from for 30 years, ever since Callista died. Eddie didn't know about Callista's investment advice. He didn't know about a lot of things. "I'm listening, son. Meadowbrook Manor has an opening. Great facility, lots of activities for seniors, or..." He paused, running his hand through his thinning hair. "Or maybe it's time to downsize. This place is worth what, maybe $180,000? You could get a nice apartment, and the extra money could help you live more comfortably." Help him live more comfortably, he meant. Eddie had always been terrible at math when it came to other people's money. "And if I don't want either option?" His mask slipped then, just for a moment, but I saw it. The flash of anger, the entitlement that had been growing stronger since his mother passed. "Dad, let's be realistic here. You've lost value. You can't maintain this place. You barely drive anymore. And frankly, it's becoming a burden on all of us." Lost value. Like I was a depreciating asset on his balance sheet. I reached for my briefcase, the same worn leather case I'd carried to work every day for 40 years. Eddie glanced at it with the same dismissive look he'd given everything else about my life lately. And that's when everything changed forever. Let me back up and tell you how we got here, because context matters when your whole world gets turned upside down. My wife Callista passed away 4 years ago. Cancer took her in 6 months, and those were the longest and shortest months of my life. Eddie showed up for the funeral, stayed 3 days, then went back to his life in Seattle. I understood. Grief is hard, and everyone processes it differently. What I didn't understand was how quickly he started treating me like I was already dead too. The first sign was the phone calls, not the frequency. Those actually decreased. It was the tone. Suddenly, every conversation started with, "Dad, are you okay?" and ended with suggestions about getting help around the house, or maybe thinking about your options for the future. I'm 72, not 92. I served in Vietnam, worked 35 years as an electrical engineer at Boeing, and raised a son who somehow grew up thinking his old man was too stupid to manage his own affairs. But that Tuesday at 2:30 p.m., standing in my kitchen while Eddie essentially gave me an eviction notice from my own home, I realized something had shifted permanently. This wasn't concern. This was calculation. "Dad, you've lost value. Nursing home or get out of my house." My house. He said my house like the deed had already been transferred. "This is my home, Eddie, and I'll remember every word you just said." He laughed, actually laughed. "Come on, Dad, don't be dramatic. The whole neighborhood's probably watching this conversation through the windows. You're embarrassing yourself." Embarrassing myself. My son, who hadn't held a steady job in 8 months, who owed money to people whose names you don't want to know, was lecturing me about embarrassment. Embarrassing? Eddie, you haven't learned the meaning of that word yet. My phone buzzed. Text message. I glanced at it briefly. Just a simple confirmation of an appointment I'd been waiting for. Eddie didn't notice. He was too busy calculating square footage and property values in his head. "Look, I've already talked to a realtor. Jennifer thinks we can list this place for $180, maybe $190 if we stage it right. After closing costs and everything, you'd walk away with enough for a down payment on a nice senior living apartment. The monthly fees wouldn't be too bad, and you'd have people around to help if something happens. If something happens." He was already writing my obituary. And if I don't agree, then you're being selfish, Dad. Mom's gone. This house is too big for one person. You're sitting on equity that could actually help your quality of life, but instead, you're being stubborn about some sentimental attachment to a building. Sentimental attachment. As if the place where I'd built a marriage, raised a child, and quietly assembled something he couldn't even imagine was just nostalgia. The briefcase sat beside my chair, unchanged and unremarkable. I'd carried it every day for 40 years, and Eddie had probably looked at it 1,000 times without ever wondering what was inside. Why would he? In his mind, I was just a retired engineer living on Social Security and a modest pension. Eddie, how much do you think I'm worth? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Total net worth. Ballpark figure. He shifted uncomfortably. I don't know, Dad. The house? Maybe some savings? $200,000, $250,000? $250,000. That's what my life's work looked like to my son. A modest estate for a modest man who'd lived a modest life. I almost felt sorry for him. And you need money right now. It wasn't a question. His wife had been calling all morning. I'd heard her voice through the phone when he answered the third time sharp, frustrated, demanding answers about Garrix and payments and promises he'd made. Everyone needs money, Dad. That's not the point. The point is making smart decisions while you still can. While I still can. As if my mental faculties were deteriorating along with my supposed property values. The black Mercedes S600 was probably still 15 minutes away, but I could already picture Eddie's face when he saw it pull into the driveway. He'd assume it was lost, maybe looking for one of the bigger houses up the street. He wouldn't imagine for a second that it was coming for me. All right, son, you've made your position very clear. So you'll consider it? Meadowbrook Manor really is a nice place. I can drive you over there this afternoon for a tour. Oh, I think this afternoon is going to be very educational for both of us. Something in my tone must have registered because he looked at me more carefully then. But it was too late. The wheels were already in motion, set in place long before this conversation started. Eddie just didn't know it yet. And that's when the real story began. The doorbell rang exactly 43 minutes after Eddie delivered his ultimatum. I wasn't surprised by the timing. I'd been expecting this moment for months. Eddie was in the living room, scrolling through real estate listings on his phone, probably calculating his inheritance down to the last dollar. He looked up when the bell rang, annoyed at the interruption. I'll get it, he said, already standing. Always eager to control the narrative, my son. I stayed in my chair, listening to his footsteps across the hardwood floor Callista and I had installed in 1987. Through the window, I could see the black Mercedes parked at the curb. Neighbors were starting to notice. Mrs. Henderson from next door was pretending to water her already soaked flower bed. Good afternoon, Edward Patterson? That's me. Who's asking? Officer Martinez, King County Sheriff's Department. I have some documents that require your immediate attention. The tone in Eddie's voice changed instantly. Documents? What kind of documents? Sir, you're being served with a restraining order. Case number CV 2024-1856. You have been ordered to cease all attempts to coerce or intimidate William Patterson regarding his living arrangements, financial decisions, or property ownership. There was a long silence. I could picture Eddie's face confusion giving way to anger, then to something approaching panic. This is ridiculous. That's my father. I was just trying to help him make some practical decisions about his living situation. Sir, the court has reviewed evidence suggesting elder financial abuse and intimidation. You're required to maintain a distance of no less than 100 feet from Mr. Patterson's residence unless he explicitly invites you here. You're also prohibited from contacting him regarding any financial matters without legal representation present. Evidence? What evidence? We were just having a conversation. Officer Martinez's voice remained perfectly professional. Sir, I'd recommend you read the document carefully. Page 3 outlines the specific allegations. You have the right to contest these orders in court, but as of right now, they're legally binding. The front door closed, and I heard Eddie's footsteps. Faster now, agitated. He appeared in the living room doorway holding a stack of legal papers, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Dad, what the hell is this? I gestured to the papers. Read page 3 out loud, Eddie. Let the neighbors hear it too. I'm sure they're curious about all the commotion. His hands shook slightly as he flipped to the 3rd page. Allegations include verbal intimidation, threats regarding housing security, attempted coercion related to property disposition, and... He stopped reading. Keep going. And evidence of planning to commit elder financial abuse through fraudulent real estate transactions. His voice dropped to a whisper. Dad, when did I what, Eddie? When did I stop being the helpless old man you thought you could manipulate? The papers rustled in his trembling hands. You hired a lawyer with what money? Your Social Security check? I reached for my briefcase, opened it slowly, and pulled out a business card. Callista Steinberg, estate planning attorney. I'd been working with her for 30 years, but Eddie didn't need to know that yet. Read the bottom of page 3, son. Read it carefully. His eyes scanned the page, and I watched his face change from confusion to something approaching fear. Elder Financial Abuse Investigation, FBI Financial Crimes Division, potential federal charges. The FBI? His voice cracked like a teenager's. Turns out, Eddie, that when you threaten to throw an elderly person out of their home to steal their property, that catches the attention of people who take those things very seriously. He looked at the restraining order again, then at me, then back at the papers. This is crazy. I was trying to help you. Help yourself, you mean? The house felt different now. The balance of power had shifted so completely that even the air seemed to vibrate with it. Eddie was still holding the papers, but his confidence was evaporating like morning fog. Dad, we can work this out. This is all a misunderstanding. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like a man who owes $63,000 to some very impatient people was trying to force his father out of his home to cover his gambling debts. Eddie's face went completely white when I mentioned the exact amount of his debt, and that was just the beginning of his education. The next morning, I drove to Callista Steinberg's office downtown. Not because I needed to, we'd planned this meeting months ago, but because Eddie needed to understand exactly who he'd been underestimating. Callista had been our family attorney since 1994, the year Eddie graduated high school. She'd handled Callista's estate, my retirement planning, and several other matters that my son had never bothered to ask about. In Eddie's mind, legal services were for rich people, and his father obviously wasn't rich. He was about to learn how wrong he was about everything. Garrick, come in. How are you holding up after yesterday? Callista Steinberg was 68, sharp as a blade, and had spent 40 years protecting people's assets from their own family members. She'd seen every variation of Eddie's story, and her success rate in these situations was nearly perfect. Better than expected, Eddie took the restraining order about as well as you'd imagine. Has he tried to contact you since Officer Martinez served the papers? 3 calls and 2 text messages. I didn't answer any of them. She nodded approvingly. Good. The prosecution needs clean evidence of continued harassment if he violates the order. Now, are you ready to move to Phase 2? Phase 2. Eddie had no idea there was a Phase 1, let alone a Phase 2. Callista opened a thick file folder, the same folder she'd been building for 30 years. Let's review the Patterson Family Trust, established March 15, 1994. Even though I knew what was coming, seeing it all laid out in black and white still gave me a moment of quiet satisfaction. 30 years of careful planning, conservative investments, and strategic property acquisitions, all documented in excruciating detail. 23 commercial properties across King County, total current market value, $85.7 million. $85.7 million. Eddie thought my entire net worth was $250,000. The Bellevue office complex we purchased in 1998 is now worth $12.3 million alone. The apartment buildings in Capitol Hill appreciated beyond our most optimistic projections. And the waterfront development properties, Callista smiled. Well, let's just say your instincts about that area were correct. Callista had always called it we and our, because that's how real partnership works. She'd managed the legal framework while I'd identified the opportunities and secured the financing. 30 years of quiet, methodical wealth building while my son assumed his father was just another struggling retiree. Personal liquid assets? $12.3 million across 4 different banks. Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase, and U.S. Bank. All managed discreetly, nothing flashy. $12.3 million in checking and savings accounts. Eddie had been worried about me affording groceries. And Eddie's inheritance under the current trust structure? Callista's expression became professionally neutral. As of yesterday's events, Edward Patterson has been permanently removed as a beneficiary of the Patterson Family Trust. The threat-based coercion documented in the restraining order triggered the bad behavior clause we built into the original framework. We'd anticipated this possibility 30 years ago, not the specific details. I'd hoped Eddie would grow up to be a better man, but the general concept of family members trying to intimidate their way to early inheritance. What happens to his portion now? The Patterson Dignity Foundation, as we discussed. Elder abuse prevention, legal advocacy, and housing security for vulnerable seniors. Your son's greed will fund protection for people just like he tried to victimize. The irony was perfect. Eddie's attempt to steal my property would result in millions of dollars being used to protect other elderly people from men just like him. Callista, there's one more thing Eddie doesn't know about. She raised an eyebrow. We'd worked together long enough that very little surprised her anymore. Operation Silver Shield. Ah, she leaned back in her chair. How long have you been cooperating with the FBI? 3 years. Ever since they first contacted me about Eddie's associations. The gambling debts weren't just gambling debts. Eddie had been borrowing from people who used elderly family members as collateral. The FBI had been building a case against an entire network of elder abuse schemes, and my son had walked right into the middle of their investigation. And yesterday's incident? Fully documented. They've been recording our conversations for 6 months, ever since Eddie started making threats about getting me help, whether I wanted it or not. Callista made a note in the file. So the restraining order serves multiple purposes. Exactly. It protects me legally, establishes a pattern of harassment for the federal case, and gives Eddie enough rope to hang himself if he keeps escalating. And if he doesn't take the hint? I thought about the desperate look in Eddie's eyes when Officer Martinez left yesterday. The panic when he realized his quick money scheme had turned into federal scrutiny. Men like Eddie don't de-escalate when they're cornered. They double down. He won't take the hint, Callista. He can't afford to. She closed the file folder and looked at me with something between admiration and concern. Garrick, what you're doing is legally sound and morally justified. But are you prepared for how far this might go? I've been preparing for 30 years. The compound interest on that statement was about to come due. Eddie's first violation of the restraining order came exactly 18 hours after he was served. Not through direct contact, he wasn't that stupid, but through his wife Jennifer. She called my landline Thursday morning, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Mr. Patterson, this is Jennifer, Eddie's wife. We need to talk. I let the silence stretch long enough to make her uncomfortable. The FBI had briefed me on this possibility. Family members often become proxies when the primary subject is legally restricted from contact. Hello, Jennifer. I'm sorry, but Eddie and I aren't supposed to be in communication right now. That's exactly what I'm calling about. This restraining order thing, it's gotten completely out of hand. Eddie's just trying to help you, and somehow it's turned into this legal nightmare. Eddie's just trying to help. The same script they'd probably rehearsed together the night before. Jennifer, do you know why your husband needs me to sell my house? Another long pause. We're going through some financial difficulties. But that's not why he's concerned about your living situation. $63,000 in gambling debts. To people who don't accept payment plans. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She knew. She'd probably known for months. Mr. Patterson, I don't know where you're getting your information, but Jennifer, stop. My voice carried 30 years of management authority that cut through her prepared talking points. Your husband threatened to throw me out of my own home to steal my property and pay his debts. We both know that's what happened. He's family. You're his father. Don't you want to help your own son? And there it was, the fundamental misunderstanding that had poisoned this whole relationship. The idea that family membership entitled Eddie to anything he needed, whenever he needed it, regardless of how he behaved. I helped my son for 45 years, Jennifer. I fed him, clothed him, put him through college, helped with his wedding expenses, and loaned him money 7 different times that he never paid back. What I won't do is let him intimidate me out of my home. But the legal Garricks. Do you know how much this is going to cost him? He can't afford to fight a court case right now. That's when I knew Eddie hadn't told her the whole truth. She thought this was just a civil dispute over property. She had no idea about Operation Silver Shield, the FBI investigation, or the federal charges that were building like storm clouds over their entire life. Jennifer, I'm going to give you some advice, and you should take it seriously. You need to distance yourself from Eddie's financial decisions before they destroy your life too. What does that mean? Before I could answer, my phone beeped with another call coming in. The caller ID made me smile. I have to take this call, Jennifer, but think about what I just said. I clicked over to the second line. Detective Kowalski? Mr. Patterson, we have a problem. Your son just tried to withdraw money from your joint Wells Fargo account, the one you added him to 3 years ago for emergencies. My joint account with Eddie. I'd almost forgotten about it. When he was going through his divorce proceedings, I'd added him to one of my smaller accounts, $22,000, just in case he needed emergency funds. He'd never touched it before. How much did he try to take? All of it, $22,000. The bank flagged it as suspicious activity given the restraining order situation, and they called us directly. Eddie was escalating exactly as predicted. The restraining order was supposed to scare him into backing down, but desperate people don't make rational decisions. What happens now? Well, this gives us clear evidence of attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person. Combined with yesterday's violations and the recorded conversations, we have enough for federal charges. Federal charges. Eddie had just graduated from family troublemaker to federal criminal. Detective, how long before he finds out his accounts are frozen? About 3 hours. We're executing the seizure warrants this afternoon. Everything, checking, savings, credit cards, the works, federal court order signed about an hour ago. I thought about Jennifer's panic, about her calling to beg for Eddie's financial future. In 3 hours, that financial future would cease to exist. He's going to blame me for this. Mr. Patterson, he should blame himself. Nobody forced him to threaten you, violate a restraining order, and attempt to steal money from a joint account. These are choices he made. Choices. Eddie had always been good at making choices and terrible at accepting their consequences. What should I do when he finds out? Nothing. Don't answer his calls, don't respond to texts, don't engage at all. If he shows up at your house, you call 911 immediately. The restraining order is still in effect, and now we have federal wire fraud charges pending. Wire fraud. The words sounded so clinical, so removed from the reality of what was happening. My son was about to discover that his entire financial life had been frozen by the federal government because he'd tried to steal from his elderly father. Detective, is it wrong that I don't feel sorry for him? Mr. Patterson, feeling sorry for people who victimize the elderly is how they keep getting away with it. Your son made his choices. Now he gets to live with the consequences. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about choices and consequences. Eddie had been making bad choices for years, but there had always been someone to bail him out. His mother when he was young, me when he was an adult, credit cards and loans when we weren't enough. Today was the day the safety net disappeared. My phone rang again. Eddie's number. I didn't answer. It rang 4 more times in the next 10 minutes. The real education was about to begin. Eddie found out about the frozen accounts at 3:47 p.m., standing in line at the Chase Bank branch on Pine Street. I know the exact time because Detective Kowalski called me the moment Eddie's attempted withdrawal triggered the federal alert system. What I didn't expect was Eddie showing up at my door 90 minutes later, pounding on the wood hard enough to rattle the frame. "Dad, open this door. We need to talk." I called 911 first, as instructed, then positioned myself near the front window where I could see him without being seen. Eddie looked like a man who just watched his life explode. Hair disheveled, shirt untucked, the kind of desperate energy that makes people dangerous. "Dad, I know you're in there. What did you do? They froze everything. Jennifer can't even buy groceries." The patrol car arrived 6 minutes later, but Eddie was too focused on his rage to notice until Officer Martinez was walking up the driveway behind him. "Mr. Patterson, step away from the door." Eddie spun around, and I could see the exact moment he recognized the same officer who'd served him the restraining order. "Officer, this is a misunderstanding. I need to talk to my father about a banking error." "Sir, you're in violation of a court order by being here. You need to leave immediately." "It's not a violation. This is family business. My father did something to my bank accounts, and I need to understand what's happening." Officer Martinez's hand moved instinctively toward his radio. "Mr. Patterson, you're currently in violation of Restraining Order CV 2024-1856. You need to leave this property immediately, or I'll have to place you under arrest." That's when Eddie made his second major mistake of the day. Arrest me for what? Trying to talk to my own father? He's obviously being manipulated by someone, and I'm trying to protect him. Manipulated. Even faced with federal charges and frozen bank accounts, Eddie still couldn't accept that his elderly father might be more capable than he'd assumed. Officer Martinez keyed his radio. "Dispatch. I need Detective Kowalski at 418 Oak Street. We have a restraining order violation in progress." "Dad," Eddie called toward the window, "whatever they told you, it's not true. I was trying to help you. This whole thing is a setup. A setup." There was something almost pathetic about watching Eddie construct conspiracy theories rather than face the simple truth. He'd threatened his father and gotten caught. Detective Kowalski arrived 8 minutes later, and that's when everything changed again. Edward Patterson? Finally, someone with authority. "Detective, my father has been manipulated into filing false reports against me, and now someone's frozen all my bank accounts. This is elder abuse in reverse." Detective Kowalski pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind the FBI uses for field interviews. "Mr. Patterson, before we continue this conversation, I need to inform you that you're being recorded. You have the right to remain silent." "What? No, wait, I don't need a lawyer. I haven't done anything wrong." "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." "Detective, listen to me. My father is 72 years old. Somebody's obviously taking advantage of him, making him think I'm some kind of threat. I was just trying to help him make some practical decisions about his living situation." Detective Kowalski finished the Miranda rights, then looked at Eddie with the kind of professional patience that comes from interrogating criminals for 20 years. "Mr. Patterson, are you familiar with recording device number FBI 4429? Eddie blinked. "What?" "Recording device FBI 4429. Small, sophisticated, nearly invisible when properly placed. We've been using it to document conversations between you and your father for the past 6 months. The color drained from Eddie's face like water from a broken dam. "Recording? What are you talking about?" "Every conversation, Mr. Patterson. Every threat, every attempt at intimidation, every plan you made to force your father out of his home. 6 months of evidence." "That's impossible. Dad doesn't even know how to use a smartphone properly." Detective Kowalski smiled. "Your father has been cooperating with a federal investigation into elder financial abuse for 3 years, Mr. Patterson. He's what we call a very reliable witness." Eddie looked at my house, then back at the detective, then at Officer Martinez, as if trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of reality. 3 years? That can't be right. What investigation? Operation Silver Shield? Ring any bells? I watched Eddie's face through the window as the pieces started falling into place. The gambling debts to connected people, the pressure to find quick money, the federal task force that had been building cases against elder abuse networks throughout the Pacific Northwest. I want a lawyer. Smart choice, Mr. Patterson, but first, let me play something for you. Detective Kowalski pressed play on the digital recorder. Eddie's voice filled the afternoon air, crystal clear and utterly damning. "Dad, let's be realistic here. You've lost value. You can't maintain this place. You barely drive anymore, and frankly, it's becoming a burden on all of us." Eddie stared at the recorder like it was a snake. "You can't. That was a private conversation between family members." Washington State is a one-party consent state, Mr. Patterson. Your father had every right to record your threats. And given that he's been working with federal investigators, those recordings constitute evidence in an ongoing criminal case. Criminal case? Elder financial abuse, attempted fraud, violation of a restraining order, and as of this afternoon, wire fraud for your attempted theft from the joint account. Wire fraud. Federal charges. Eddie was looking at years in federal prison, and he still didn't understand how he'd gotten here. Detective, my father obviously doesn't understand what he's gotten involved in. He's elderly, confused, probably scared. Someone's using him. Mr. Patterson, your father contacted us 3 years ago. He's been working with federal agents longer than you've been planning to steal his house. And that's when Eddie learned the most important lesson of his life. Never underestimate a man just because he's old enough to be your father. The arrest happened on Friday morning. Eddie had spent Thursday night in his car outside my neighborhood, probably trying to figure out his next move. Detective Kowalski called to warn me he was out there, circling like a shark who'd smelled blood but couldn't find the source. What Eddie found instead was FBI agent Sarah Chen waiting in his driveway when he finally went home. Edward Patterson, FBI. We have a federal warrant for your arrest. I wasn't there to see it, but Detective Kowalski filled me in later. Eddie had tried to run, made it about 40 yards before 2 additional agents tackled him in his neighbor's front yard. The whole street got to watch Eddie Patterson, the man who'd been threatening to evict his elderly father for financial gain, get dragged away in federal handcuffs. But that was just the beginning of Eddie's education. Agent Chen called me that afternoon with news that made my blood run cold. Mr. Patterson, we need to talk. In person. There are some developments in your son's case that you need to understand. An hour later, Agent Chen sat in my living room, the same room where Eddie had delivered his ultimatum just 4 days earlier. The contrast wasn't lost on either of us. How much do you know about your son's gambling debts? $63,000. Detective Kowalski mentioned it when we first discussed the investigation. Mr. Patterson, that was 6 months ago. The current total is closer to $320,000. $320,000. In 6 months, Eddie had quintupled his debt to people who didn't accept bankruptcy as an excuse. How is that possible? Your son wasn't just gambling, Mr. Patterson. He was laundering money for a criminal organization, using elderly victims' assets as collateral for larger operations. Laundering money. My son hadn't just been trying to steal my house to pay gambling debts. He'd been using me as collateral for criminal enterprises I couldn't even comprehend. What does that mean exactly? Agent Chen opened a thick file folder, the kind that represents months of investigation and thousands of hours of federal resources. Your son was part of a network that identifies elderly property owners with substantial assets and minimal family oversight. They use family members to pressure the victims into property transfers, then use those properties as collateral for money laundering operations. And I was the target. You were supposed to be the target. But your cooperation with our investigation allowed us to document the entire operation from the inside. Agent Chen spread photos across my coffee table. Eddie meeting with men I'd never seen before. Eddie at locations I'd never heard of. Eddie signing documents that could have put him in federal prison for decades. Mr. Patterson, your son was planning to forge a power of attorney and transfer your property to shell companies controlled by this criminal organization. If you'd signed over your house voluntarily, you would have been murdered within 60 days. Murdered. The word hit me like a physical blow. Eddie hadn't just been planning to steal from me, he'd been planning to have me killed. Are you certain about this? We have him on tape discussing the timeline. Once the property transfer was complete, you became a liability. Elderly victims who know too much about the operation don't survive long. I thought about Eddie's growing desperation, his insistence that I move to a nursing home, his absolute certainty that I needed to downsize immediately. I'd thought it was greed. It was actually a death sentence. Agent Chen, how many other families has this organization targeted? 47 elderly victims across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Total stolen assets, approximately $230 million. Total casualties. She paused. 14 elderly victims who died of natural causes after signing over their property. 14 murders. Eddie had been working with people who'd killed 14 elderly people to steal their assets. And my son knew this? Mr. Patterson, your son was present during planning discussions for 3 previous operations. He knew exactly what happened to elderly victims after the property transfers were complete. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what Agent Chen was telling me. My son wasn't just a gambling addict trying to steal my house. He was an accessory to multiple murders. What happens now? Your son is facing federal charges under the RICO Act. Racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, money laundering, and wire fraud. He's looking at life in federal prison. Life in prison. 4 days ago, Eddie had been my disappointing but still hopeful son. Now he was a federal criminal facing life without parole. Agent Chen, how long have you known about the murder component? 6 months. Ever since we intercepted communications about your case, that's when we escalated your protection detail and accelerated the timeline for Eddie's arrest. Protection detail. I thought about the unmarked cars I'd noticed in my neighborhood recently, the same faces appearing at the grocery store and the bank. I'd assumed it was paranoia. You've been watching my house. 24 hours a day since we learned about the murder timeline. Your son's associates were growing impatient with the delays. If he'd been unable to manipulate you into signing over the property, they would have moved to more direct methods. More direct methods. Murder. Eddie's backup plan had been to have his father killed. Agent Chen, did Eddie know about the protection detail? No. But his handlers were starting to suspect federal involvement. Your son was scheduled to be eliminated this weekend if he couldn't produce results. Eliminated. Eddie had been working for people who were planning to kill him too. I thought about the desperate look in Eddie's eyes when Officer Martinez served the restraining order, the panic when his bank accounts were frozen, the rage when he pounded on my door yesterday afternoon. He hadn't just been facing financial ruin, he'd been facing execution by his own criminal partners. Agent Chen, when Eddie found out about the frozen accounts, did he contact his handlers? Yes. And their response was to move up his elimination timeline. Your son was going to die this weekend, Mr. Patterson. Arresting him yesterday probably saved his life. Saved his life. The federal charges that would send Eddie to prison for the rest of his life had also saved him from being murdered by his criminal associates. What happens to the other victims' families? Justice, Mr. Patterson. Because of your cooperation, we've been able to build cases against the entire network. 43 arrests yesterday, across 3 states. The largest elder abuse bust in FBI history. 43 arrests. 14 murder victims would finally get justice, and dozens of other elderly people would be safe from predators like my son. But none of that changed the fundamental truth. My own son had been planning to have me murdered. The wire for the final conversation was my idea. Agent Chen had explained that while they had enough evidence to convict Eddie on multiple federal charges, there was one more piece they needed to close the case completely. Eddie admitting on tape that he knew about the murder component of the organization's operations. Mr. Patterson, this is dangerous. Your son is facing life in prison. Desperate people make unpredictable choices. Agent Chen, my son was planning to have me murdered. I think that ship has sailed on predictable choices. The setup was simple. Eddie would be released on federal bail, a calculated risk to allow the final operation, and I would agree to meet with him one last time. Neutral location, public place, federal agents positioned within 50 feet. Starbucks on Pine Street, Friday afternoon at 4:15 p.m. Busy enough to seem normal, controlled enough to keep me safe. Eddie looked like he'd aged 10 years in 5 days. Federal jail had stripped away the last pretense of his confidence, leaving behind something hollow and desperate. He sat across from me with the careful movements of someone who understood that his entire life depended on the next 30 minutes. Dad, thank you for agreeing to see me. I'd practiced this conversation with Agent Chen for 2 hours. Every word had to be perfect, natural enough to avoid suspicion, but direct enough to generate the confession they needed. Eddie, you're my son. Whatever's happened between us, I needed to hear your side of the story. Dad, I've made some terrible mistakes. The gambling, the people I got involved with, the way I treated you. I'm sorry. I'm really genuinely sorry. For a moment, he almost sounded like the boy I'd raised. Almost. Tell me about these people you got involved with. Eddie glanced around the coffee shop, a habit he'd developed since associating with criminals who solved problems through violence. They're dangerous, Dad. More dangerous than I understood when I first started working with them. They promised easy money, quick solutions to my debts, but the price... He shook his head. The price was higher than I thought. What price? Dad, they don't just steal property. They eliminate complications. Eliminate complications. The euphemism that federal prosecutors would play for a jury. What does that mean, Eddie? It means elderly people who sign over their assets don't live long enough to file complaints or talk to investigators. There it was. Confession to knowledge of multiple murders, recorded on FBI equipment, admissible in federal court. Eddie, are you telling me these people kill elderly victims after they steal their property? Yes, Dad, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And I knew it. I knew it when I started pressuring you to sign over the house. You knew they would kill me? Eddie's voice dropped to a whisper. After the property transfer was complete, you would have been murdered, and it would have looked like natural causes. Heart attack, stroke, something that wouldn't trigger an investigation. And you were okay with that? I was desperate, Dad. $300,000 in debt to people who break legs first and ask questions later. They told me it was the only way to clear my debts and keep Jennifer safe. So you chose their safety over mine. I chose what felt like survival. But Dad, I need you to understand something else. They were planning to kill me too, after the operation was complete. I was a liability, someone who knew too much about their methods. When did you learn that? 2 weeks ago. When I realized I couldn't manipulate you into signing over the house voluntarily, I told them we needed more time. That's when they explained that my timeline was also limited. You were going to die anyway. Yeah, Dad, I was going to die anyway. But I thought maybe if I could give them your property, I could buy enough time to figure out an escape plan. I looked at my son across the table, the man who'd been planning to have me murdered to save his own life, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete emotional detachment from my own child. Eddie, do you understand what you just told me? I told you the truth, Dad. Finally. You told me that you were willing to have me murdered to save yourself from people who were planning to murder you anyway. He nodded slowly. Yes, that's exactly what I just told you. Agent Chen was right. This was the confession that would ensure Eddie never hurt another elderly person again. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the outcome was decided in the first 10 minutes when federal prosecutor Maria Santos played Eddie's confession to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to hear the defendant, in his own words, admit to conspiracy to murder his 72-year-old father for financial gain. I sat in the gallery, watching 12 ordinary Americans hear my son calmly explain how he'd planned to have me killed. The woman in seat 4 covered her mouth in horror. The man in seat 7 shook his head in disgust. By the time the recording finished, 3 jurors were openly staring at Eddie like he was something diseased. Eddie's court-appointed attorney, David Morrison, was competent but had been handed an unwinnable case. How do you defend a man who confessed on federal recording equipment to planning his father's murder? Your Honor, my client was coerced into these actions by dangerous criminals who threatened his life and the life of his wife. Edward Patterson is as much a victim in this case as anyone else. Victim. Even facing life in federal prison, Eddie was still trying to avoid responsibility for his choices. Prosecutor Santos wasn't buying it. Your Honor, the defendant had multiple opportunities to contact law enforcement about these alleged threats. Instead, he chose to participate in a criminal conspiracy that included the planned murder of his elderly father. The defendant's financial problems don't justify elder abuse and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence was overwhelming. FBI surveillance footage of Eddie meeting with known criminals, bank records showing the progression of his debts, phone recordings of him discussing timeline pressure and eliminating complications, and through it all, the wire recordings from our final conversation where Eddie admitted he knew the operation would end with my death. On day 12, Eddie's wife, Jennifer, took the stand as a character witness. I almost felt sorry for her as she tried to paint her husband as a caring son who'd gotten in over his head with dangerous people. Eddie loves his father. He would never hurt him intentionally. He was just desperate and scared. Prosecutor Santos wasn't gentle during cross-examination. Mrs. Patterson, were you aware that your husband owed $320,000 to a criminal organization? Yes. I knew about the gambling debts. Were you aware that your husband was planning to forge legal documents to steal his father's property? No, I wasn't aware of that. Were you aware that your husband knew his father would be murdered after signing over his assets? Jennifer broke down crying at that point, and I realized she was learning about the murder component for the first time in open court. Eddie had never told her that his plan to steal my house included having me killed. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, not because the evidence was complicated, but because they needed time to process the moral enormity of what Eddie had planned. Judge Patricia Hayes, 68 years old with 40 years of federal court experience, had seen every kind of criminal case imaginable. But even she seemed shaken when she addressed Eddie directly during sentencing. "Mr. Patterson, in 40 years on this bench, I have never encountered a case that so clearly illustrates the corruption of family bonds by greed and desperation. You plan to murder your own father, a man who raised you, supported you, and loved you, to steal property that would have been used to launder money for a criminal organization." Eddie stood in his orange jumpsuit, finally understanding that the consequences of his choices were about to become permanent. "The federal sentencing guidelines for your crimes suggest a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. However, your cooperation in bringing down the larger criminal organization warrants some consideration." Eddie's attorney leaned forward hopefully. Even a small reduction could mean the difference between dying in prison and potentially seeing freedom again after 30 or 40 years. "Edward Patterson, you are hereby sentenced to life in federal prison with possibility of parole after 25 years. You will serve a minimum of 25 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. 25 years minimum. Eddie would be 70 years old before he could even apply for parole. If it was granted, and given the nature of his crimes, that was a significant if he'd be older when released than I was when he tried to have me killed. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $500,000 to the Patterson Dignity Foundation for elder abuse prevention programs. $500,000. Money Eddie didn't have, would never have, and couldn't earn while spending the next quarter century in federal prison. Judge Hayes looked at me then, the elderly father who'd helped bring down a criminal organization by having the courage to fight back against his own son. "Mr. Patterson, this court wants to acknowledge your extraordinary courage in cooperating with federal authorities despite the personal cost. Your actions have prevented additional murders and protected vulnerable elderly citizens throughout the Pacific Northwest." After court adjourned, I stood in the hallway outside courtroom 3B, watching federal marshals lead Eddie away in shackles. He looked back once, and our eyes met across the distance. There was no recognition there, no remorse. Just the hollow stare of a man who still couldn't understand how his elderly father had outmaneuvered him so completely. That was the last time I saw my son as anything other than a cautionary tale. The phone call came 3 days after Eddie's sentencing, while I was sitting in my kitchen reading the newspaper coverage of the trial. Agent Chen's voice carried a tone I hadn't heard before, something between admiration and apology. "Mr. Patterson, there's something about this case that you need to understand. Something we haven't told you." I set down the newspaper, already knowing that whatever she was about to say would change my understanding of everything that had happened. "I'm listening, Agent Chen." "Operation Silver Shield didn't begin 3 years ago when you contacted us about Eddie's behavior. It began 5 years ago, when we first identified the criminal organization and started building cases against them. 5 years ago, before Eddie's gambling became unmanageable, before the threat started, before any of this began." "What are you saying?" "Mr. Patterson, we approached you first, not the other way around." The words hung in the air like smoke, rearranging my understanding of the past 3 years. "You approached me?" "The FBI identified your son as a potential recruitment target for this organization 18 months before he actually made contact with them. His gambling patterns, his financial stress, his access to an elderly father with property assets. He fit their victim profile perfectly." Victim profile. They'd been watching Eddie long before Eddie started watching me. "Agent Chen, are you telling me this entire situation was a setup?" "Mr. Patterson, we asked you to help us document his progression from family member to criminal conspirator. Every conversation, every threat, every escalation was recorded as evidence in a larger investigation." I thought about the wire devices I'd worn, the careful documentation of Eddie's growing desperation, the precise timing of legal actions that seemed to push him toward more extreme choices. "You used me as bait. We used your cooperation to protect other elderly victims and build cases against an organization responsible for 14 murders and over $200 million in stolen assets." "And Eddie? Your son made his own choices, Mr. Patterson. We didn't force him to threaten you. violate a restraining order, or plan your murder. We simply documented his decisions and gave him opportunities to make better ones. Opportunities he'd refused at every step. Agent Chen, if you'd known from the beginning that Eddie would escalate to planning my murder, would you have still asked for my cooperation? There was a long pause. Mr. Patterson, we didn't know how far he would go, but yes, we would have asked. Because stopping this organization was worth the risk. Worth the risk. My life had been worth the risk of exposing a criminal network that preyed on vulnerable elderly people. How many other families were part of this operation? 47 families. 47 elderly victims with family members who could be pressured or recruited. You were the only one whose family member was already under FBI surveillance. And the others? 12 victims were successfully manipulated into property transfers before we could intervene. 8 of those victims are dead. 8 more murders. 8 elderly people who died because their own family members chose money over human life. Mr. Patterson, I want you to understand something. Your willingness to cooperate with this investigation saved lives. Not just your own, but the lives of future victims who would have been targeted by this organization. I sat in my kitchen, looking at the newspaper photo of Eddie being led away in handcuffs, and realized that everything I thought I understood about this story was wrong. I hadn't been protecting myself from my greedy son. I'd been helping the FBI document how ordinary family relationships could be corrupted into criminal conspiracies. Eddie had been wrong about everything. But so had I. The real story wasn't about a father outmaneuvering his son. It was about how evil spreads through families when good people do nothing to stop it, and how sometimes stopping evil requires choices that destroy the people you love. 6 months later, I moved out of the house on Oak Street. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to start fresh somewhere that didn't echo with Eddie's threats and broken promises. The penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle has a view of Puget Sound and windows that stretch from floor to ceiling. I can afford it easily now that the Patterson Family Trust is being managed exactly as Callista and I planned 30 years ago. The Patterson Dignity Foundation opened its doors in September, funded with $2 million from the trust and Eddie's court-ordered restitution payments that he'll never be able to make. We provide legal advocacy for elderly victims of family financial abuse, emergency housing for seniors who've been threatened or intimidated by relatives, and education programs about recognizing manipulation tactics. Every week, I meet with 3 or 4 elderly people whose own children or grandchildren have tried to steal their homes, empty their bank accounts, or pressure them into signing over their life savings. The stories are depressingly similar. Family members who view their elderly relatives as ATM machines instead of human beings. Callista Steinberg still handles the legal framework for the foundation, though she's talking about retirement. Detective Kowalski serves on our advisory board, bringing 20 years of experience with elder crimes. Agent Chen speaks at our educational seminars about federal protections for vulnerable seniors. I haven't spoken to Eddie since the trial. He sends letters from federal prison occasionally, but I return them unopened. Jennifer divorced him while he was awaiting sentencing and moved back to California with their children. I hope they build better lives without him. Some people ask if I ever regret cooperating with the FBI investigation that sent my son to prison. The answer is simple. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that Eddie chose greed over family, that he was willing to have me murdered for money, that he became the kind of man who preys on elderly people. But I don't regret stopping him. The truth about dignity is that it's not determined by what others see, but by who you choose to be when they're not looking. For 30 years, I chose to be a man who built something lasting. For 5 years, Eddie chose to be a man who would destroy anyone to get what he wanted. Every Thursday evening, I host a support group for elderly people whose families have betrayed them financially. We share stories, offer advice, and remind each other that blood relationship doesn't justify abuse. Subscribe to hear more stories about justice and courage, and comment below with the name of the place where you feel safest in this world. Because everyone deserves dignity in their golden years, regardless of what their children think they're worth.